Good morning. Welcome to our public discussion, The Transformation of Warfare in the 21st Century at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. My name is Christina Shori-Liang. I lead the Terrorism and PVE cluster, and I'm course director of the New Issues in Security course at the GCSP. I have this morning the privilege to chair today what I hope will be an exciting and illuminating and very thought-provoking discussion on implications of surrogate warfare. What does it mean for global security in general and for national security in particular? I have today both of the authors of the Surrogate Warfare, The Transformation of War in the 21st Century, Dr. Andreas Krieg and Dr. Jean-Marc Rickley, as well as a discussant, Dr. Michael Raska, who is here all the way from Singapore to join the discussion. First of all, I'm going to introduce the panel to you, and then I will introduce the topic. Dr. Andreas Krieg is assistant professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College. He's co-founder of the Near East Center of Security and Strategy, and the Private Military and Security Research Group at King's College. Dr. Jean-Marc Rickley is head of Global Risk and Resilience at the Geneva Center for Security Policy and also research fellow at King's College. Dr. Michael Raska is the assistant professor and coordinator of the Military Transformations Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Everyone's doing it. The Arab, Gulf states, the Chinese, the Russians, the UK, and the Americans. Surrogate warfare. It is an emerging phenomenon when it comes to 21st century conflicts. Warfare has shifted from the classical model of war, where states employ citizens en masse, to the use of human or technological substitutes in order to minimize the costs and burdens of war. The book, Surrogate Warfare, explores how both state and non-state agents are employing tactics such as contracting out operations to rebel groups and militias and private organizations, and using armed drones and cyber propaganda. In the fight against ISIS, for example, a huge range of clashing surrogate groups are looking to secure their own advantages, all by using also different states. Apart from analyzing the underlying socio-political drivers that encourage patrons to substitute or supplement military action, this book looks at the intrinsic trade-offs between substitutions and control that shape the relationships between patron and surrogate. By outsourcing, states can they really retain control over the conflict and prevent other agendas from coming to the fore? As we will discuss, the global system increasingly resembles the medieval state of anarchy, in which non-state, state, and superstate actors are competing over limited resources, influence, and power. We have, in a sense, a neo-medieval state of anarchy in the 21st century. It's also driven by becoming more privatized, more globalized, more securitized, and more mediatized. I believe we have a lot to cover in this session, so I would like to address the first question to the authors. Why was this book written?
Let me go first. Yeah, thank you very much for coming, everyone. That's a good crowd, I think. This book came about, so me and Jean-Marc used to be colleagues in Qatar for King's College London. We had a contract with the Qatar Armed Forces, and we were looking originally at, Middle Eastern conflicts and how they were fought, not just by the local Gulf countries, but also superpowers operating in the area, whether it's the Russians, the Americans. And we found this paradigm that seemed to be recurring in all these spheres, especially when we look at how new technology was used, how we're trying to, and Western states in particular, trying to use human surrogates across the regions. Then we realized the Iranians are using them, the Russians are using them in Syria. And basically the old concept that we used to have of warfare as a trinitarian concept between the state, the society, and the soldier no longer really exists. We were not going as far as Van Creveld did very famously in his book in the early 1990s, saying that we're moving towards a non-Trinitarian war. But we are working, we thought, we see this trend of wars going into the direction of becoming assemblages, whereby as much as possible can be outsourced and externalized to surrogates. And these surrogates can take all kinds of shapes and forms. And we didn't, and there's a lot of caveat in that, obviously, but what we didn't want to do, we didn't want to write a book that is only looking very narrowly at proxy warfare as a concept that came out of the Cold War. We also didn't want to look at surrogate warfare only from a Western point of view, because we think it is something that is inherent in the system, in this conflict, in this system of conflicts that we're seeing in the 21st century. And you already alluded to the fact, we feel that the war in the 21st century, or the world in the 21st century, is determined by increased globalization, obviously, increased privatization, which means the state is giving up and surrendering more and more of the services that the state used to internalize, and among them is also warfare. We realized that much of how we deal with conflicts today is part of a process of securitization, where we fight wars sometimes not knowing why we fight them. We're involved in conflicts without us being able to justify why we're part of these conflicts. And we are fighting threats that are becoming increasingly intangible and subjective. And last but not least, we're involved in wars that are highly mediatized, or conflicts that are highly mediatized. So we are involving in war. We get involved in war over narratives, and we see this particularly spinning out at the moment in the Gulf crisis across the Middle East. It's all about narratives, and we see this definitely with the U.S. elections. It's about narratives. It's about selling these narratives, and the way this is being done is obviously in an unconventional realm of warfare. And some of you might say, "Oh, that's actually not war," and there's something we can discuss later on. But what it is basically we use increasingly human and technological surrogates to achieve strategic objectives in a coercive and subversive way. And this is what this book is all about. We saw this, and we started writing this book, I think, in 2015, 2016, and it was published earlier this year. So, do you want to add something?
Yeah, what we were witnessing as well was... Good. Thank you. What we're witnessing as well, I spent 5 years in the Gulf from 2011 to 2016, and I saw the Arab Spring and the way the Arab Spring basically spread in the Middle East. And when we were in Qatar, basically from 2013, we had early warnings about the emergence of a group that will be later called the Islamic State. And so we're witnessing the way this group developed, but also once ISIS broke the international agenda with the use of hyper-violence mediated by social media, a strategy of shock and awe. This strategy was developed in the 90s by the American, but the idea was to use conventional weapons to knock out your adversary by using massive violence and then creating a feeling of awe and then compel your adversary to your will. What ISIS did was to use the exact same concept but use hyper-violence through the numerous decapitation and using social media to get their message across through the virality of social media. And you could say that ISIS was the first organization who understood the power of technology, social media as a force multiplier. So that was really something that had to be taken into account. And in the old concept of proxy war, it is very much has a connotation of the Cold War, if you think about Vietnam or Angola. Here we're talking about something different. We're talking about states and non-state actors alike using human or technological surrogates. And at the same time of that happened, we also worked increasingly on artificial intelligence, and what we see developing with artificial intelligence, especially with the concept of autonomous weapons system, is potentially the true technological surrogate, because weapons will have an autonomous capacity that they don't have until now. Until now it's automated system, but truly autonomous weapons system will be able to decide about life and death without human input. And that raises lots of ethical issues about control and autonomy of the weapon, the same kind of issues that we witness when we talk about armed groups and human surrogates.
Thank you, both. I would like to ask you now, what are the key arguments of the book, and what is its new contribution to strategic studies?
Right, let me... well, that's a very broad question. basically, what we looking at the element of strategy here, not only from a military point of view, because those of you who are practitioners, you understand obviously that if you want to achieve anything in strategic affairs today, you need to use a multiplicity and a hybridity of different means and ways at your disposal to achieve your strategic objectives. And surrogate warfare does not only fit into the military domain, it kind of transcends a lot of different domains. What has changed with surrogate warfare, though, and I mean this is the key aspect of this book is about delegation and assemblage. So it is, we're looking particularly at the externalization of the burden of warfare to human and technological surrogates. And what we then say is what we create are these assemblages of war, whereby the state might be the most important one, but just one of many components of this assemblage. So the state might be the patron that authorizes a particular action, but it uses components, the state uses components that are not inherent to the state. So it might use its own conventional military, but it does that in conjunction with, let's say, cyber surrogates that operate on social media. It might do so in conjunction with non-state actors on the ground that are armed, like the US did in northern Syria with the SDF, or the UAE are doing with the STC in southern Yemen. And it's this assemblage of different elements and different components together that create a very, very hybrid, fluid, and very flexible structure, what we call neo-Trinitarian war. It's not non-Trinitarian, but there is a trinity in there, but this trinity is completely changed from the Clausewitzian trinity, from the idea that Clausewitz was advancing in the early 19th century. Looking at strategy, what does that mean? And also we need to understand why we've gotten to that point. We say we operate in a very complex 21st century environment. As I say, it's globalized, securitized, privatized, and mediatized. In this kind of environment, states are forced sometimes to intervene and get involved in conflicts without their public actually understanding why they're there. And this is part of the whole ISIS operation, part of why the Americans got into Syria. We understand that we need to do something in Syria. Our public says, we want you to do something in Syria, but please don't use our own troops. So, there is a particular risk aversion there. And this is a political risk aversion. And the political risk aversion exists in those people in the government, in particular in liberal democracies, but not only in liberal democracies, because we see this kind of dynamic play out in Russia. We see this dynamic play out in Iran as well, when there are internal political pressures on the government, whereby people are saying, we don't want you to use our funds or using our soldiers to achieve particular objectives that are external to what the state actually, to our vital national interests. And so when the states intervene in conflicts that they don't consider to be vital national interests, they still think they need to do something. They're still trying to intervene, but they're doing so at minimal costs, minimal political, minimal human cost, minimal financial costs. And they're doing that so without actually the ambition of saying to, back in the day we used to say we basically seize, hold and build. This was our old strategy. This is what we wanted to achieve when we intervened somewhere. Major combat operations, we go in, we decapitate, we then rebuild, we secure first and then we rebuild. That is something you cannot do with surrogate warfare, because with surrogate warfare you obviously delegate, and by delegating you lose control over what you're doing, and you're losing control over those surrogates. So you're already conscious in your mind that you will not be able to completely bring a wholehearted, comprehensive victory to this particular operation. And this is already implied, and we see this very much in the debate that's been going on in Washington in DOD about Syria. It's not, the intervention in northern Syria had very limited objectives. Much of when we get involved coercively or subversively, it's about limited objectives. And surrogate warfare is tailored towards achieving these limited objectives in a way that they're saying it's mostly about disruption. We're not there to achieve anything tangible and actually sit on the table and dictate almost the outcome of a conflict, as we might have done in the past with major combat operations, when we bring our entire conventional war machinery to bear. Because here we're saying, let the surrogates do the work, let them be there, let them disrupt the enemy, rather than without us actually having a clear strategy of what we want to achieve. And we see this very much in Syria. The most important players in Syria today are Iran, Russia, and Turkey. and Turkey to a lesser extent. It's not the West. The West is not really at the table anymore, and it was a conscious decision. But you know, the Americans said we don't want to completely surrender that territory because we're fighting also a war against terrorism and a war against jihadism, and we're doing that using surrogates. But what we cannot do is, what the West is not able to do with these surrogates is obviously dictate the outcome of it. And you know, we've kind of borrowed this concept from the Iranians, and the last chapter of the book is looking at Iran, because I think the Iranians are like the champion of that particular type of warfare by externalization, working with surrogate. And the Iranians have gone to full length to externalize even their strategic defense to surrogates. That is the argument that we're making. Because they're basically saying we're trying to bring conflict to the countries around us. We will tie down our enemies in conflict overseas in all these different conflicts. And at this point, we keep them busy and they will not move on ourselves. The problem with that is, though, Iran is not really dictating the outcome of any of these conflicts. They are very important in Lebanon, they're very important in Syria, they're very important in Iraq, and they're also very important in Yemen. But they're not there to actually dictate the outcome of what's happening in these conflicts. And I think that's the key issue. But the Iranians are fine with it. As long as they disrupt and they keep others busy, that's fair enough for them. The same goes for the Russians. I think the Russians they're very conscious of their limited capabilities and capacities in Syria as well. They're not there to actually bring an end to the conflict. They're there to basically disrupt the other side, making sure that the Americans don't achieve what they want to achieve. So surrogate warfare is very good for these very limited operations, but that comes with a massive caveat. Obviously, you are externalizing, basically you give up control over human rights abuses. It allows you to externalize human rights abuses and war crimes. You lose control. The more you delegate, the more you lose control, the more you also in the long run will be unable to achieve your strategic objectives, because there is always a diversion over time whereby the surrogate is trying to achieve more autonomy and thereby moving away from the command and control of the patron. So this is another aspect of, you want to maybe talk about autonomy and control as being one of the components of the book that we're looking at as well.
Sure, but first, the contribution of the book probably is not a typical academic book, because it caters to the audience, the academic audience, as well as the public more in general. And what we try to do is come up with conceptualization of surrogate warfare. But if you know not much about the history of warfare, that will give you also a very good update about how we have thought about warfare over the past century. And the idea was really to refresh a bit the debate about the future of warfare, because if you look at what happened since the end of the Cold War, immediately after the end of the Cold War, the debate was really about the so-called concept of revolution in military affairs, so the idea of network-centric warfare and how basically you can disrupt your adversary using technology. And then 9/11 happened, and the entire focus of academia in warfare went to counter-insurgency, and that lasted a few years. And since the early 2010, if you want, in the 90s there was also this debate on new wars, the privatization of violence, the idea that the state becomes increasingly irrelevant. It's private actors that matter. And basically in 2010, what you see is these different dynamics playing in parallel. So there was a need to update how we talk about warfare, and also to incorporate technology a bit more, not like the silver bullet, but how technology is an enabler to certain actors, and also how technology democratizes the access to powerful tools that could have a disruptive impact. And I think, as Andreas mentioned earlier, there was also this idea of coercion. You know, that warfare is seen by many as using military force, but it's about coercion. And so there is a need for thinking about how do we coerce our adversaries in the 21st century. Now, when we talk about autonomy and control, obviously there is this divide. If you give your surrogate lots of autonomy for economic cost or political cost, that is good because you are less exposed. But obviously there is the problem of control. And so there is this spectrum between autonomy and control that needs, this equation that needs to be solved. Just give you an example of how this could actually backfire. When we talk about Syria, starting in end of 2012, early 2013, the CIA set up an operation called Timber Sycamore, and the idea was to identify rebel groups in Syria that would actually be provided with ammunition, weapons to fight Assad. And the CIA basically vetted a few groups and originally trained them, but then in the end, very early, they provided them with weapons. So there was the problem of where this weapon would end up, and some of this weapon ended up in the hands of al-Nusra, so the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. And then 2014, you have the Islamic State, and the Pentagon this time set up an operation to counter the Islamic State. And a few initiatives failed, but by 2015 they set up the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is an assemblage of mostly Kurdish YPG fighter as well as Arab fighter. And in 2016, because the rebels in Syria were pushed more towards the east, and the Kurds were gaining territory towards the west, they started to meet between Aleppo and the Turkish border. And so suddenly you ended up having a CIA, US surrogate from CIA fighting a Pentagon surrogate from the United States, fighting each other. So basically the United States were supporting groups that were fighting each other underground. So this is how basically your operation could get out of control. And this is the entire problem of surrogate warfare. As Andreas rightly mentioned, surrogate warfare is really good at disrupting things on the ground, denying that your adversary will achieve his strategic objective. But it's very difficult to use surrogate warfare to actually establish a fait accompli.
Thank you. That leads us to the next question is, what is a human surrogate? And Andreas, I'm directing that question to you.
Right. What is an... basically, it comes from the... What is a surrogate? Surrogare in Latin means basically to delegate or to substitute. But it doesn't have to be a substitute. A surrogate can also be a supplement. Because in most of these assemblages, you don't entirely take out your own forces and replace them with someone else. But what you're doing is you do a limited boots on the ground approach, mostly special forces, and then they have force multiplication with surrogates. A human surrogate, I mean, and this is where, the historical chapter of this book goes into continuity, and we're looking at the history of war, and obviously the history of war is full of patron-surrogate relationships. The entire British Empire was only able to exist and function because of patron-surrogate relationships. The British Navy, the Royal Navy, actually had surrogates and auxiliaries all the way until the 20th century. So it's the idea of the Clausewitzian idea of saying, we have someone in uniform and, this kind of levé en masse idea of the citizen in uniform serving his country is something that is really an historic anomaly. It's not. It's if you look at history, it's really not something that is very common. So surrogate warfare very much goes back to the pre-modern times before the French Revolution, before levé en masse, to what I would call the era of the cabinet wars, where wars were fought by the executive, by the aristocracy for their own interest, with very little involvement of the people. And I mean, the people were always suffering, but the people weren't really contributing to the war effort unless they were paying taxes. And obviously, in a fiefdom, in a feudal system, people weren't paying taxes. They basically were owned by whoever was the lord of the land. But it was basically aristocracy against aristocracy. It was feudal executive against another feudal executive. And today, surrogate wars are great means for executives to fight wars, because since in every democracy, obviously there are different checks and balances in place. But if you fight a war, particularly if you use the CIA or an intelligence service to mobilize the surrogate, it's something you can do with under the radar of public attention. You can do this without democratic checks and balances, and you can do this relatively effectively and very quickly. And I think that was part of if you remember 9/11, the initial operation with the Northern Alliance was probably the quintessential surrogate operation. It was able to mobilize so quickly. Obviously, not in the same coherent way that you would if you had your own military in terms of what you can achieve, but you were able to do something quickly. A human surrogate can be anything from, in the history, auxiliaries, which would accompany your military. It can be a private security company, private military company. It can be a rebel group, an insurgency group, a terrorist organization. It can be any sort of non-state actor, but a surrogate can also be a state if you want to be. You have larger states using smaller states, for example, but mostly it's state to non-state actor. Sometimes we have also non-state actors using other surrogates. And the thing with, we talk about the principal-agent relationship and principal-agents theory in our book. The problem that I have with principal-agents theory is that it's very much top-down. And when you look at assemblages, it's a very flat hierarchy, if you will, at times. And sometimes the patron becomes the surrogate and the surrogate becomes the patron. An interesting example here is the relationship between Iran and the Houthis, or Iran and Hezbollah, or Syria and Hezbollah. In the relationship between the Syrian government and Hezbollah, you might say in the 1980s that it's very much the Syrian government being the patron and Hezbollah being the executive principal and the executive agent, in that respect, the surrogate. But over time, it has actually changed. And now you could make an argument that the Syrian government, particularly during the civil war, is very much relying on Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has a lot more authority over the Syrian government, a lot more leverage. It's surrogate warfare or surrogate assemblages are very volatile, very flexible kind of relationships that change over time, and they can change very quickly. So it's not really top-down. And in this respect, you could make a case that maybe Hezbollah is sometimes using as well Syrian regular forces or Syrian irregular forces and operate and direct them in operation inside Syria. In that respect, you could make then the case that Hezbollah is the patron and the government of Syria and its irregular forces are the surrogate. So it's not clear cut. It's not black and white. And I think the interesting thing about this concept is that it takes place in the gray zone. And warfare in the 21st century is all about the gray area. And that is basically to say, if you operate in the gray zone, nothing is ever set in stone, and everything is constantly changing, and it's all about flexibility. And that is something that a normal statutory military cannot provide you. A statutory security sector will not provide you with that level of flexibility than a surrogate does, and that's why we're opting for surrogates. With all and obviously we're going we'll talk about it later on about what the problems of this are. But it looks on the outset, if you look at the problems that the state is faced with, it looks like this is a panacea or a silver bullet that allows you to do the things you need to do, and doing them at limited costs.
Thank you. We see now weaponized drones basically as the first true application of a machine as a surrogate. But could you analyze more, what is a technical surrogate?
Right, so one of the key issue that has been mentioned is the advantage of surrogate warfare is to provide plausible deniability. And when you use technology, especially at a distance or remote weapons, you achieve plausible deniability because it's more difficult to track. So you could say that the first weapons, the V1 if you want, were the origins of this idea of technology as a surrogate. And obviously with development in technology, notably GPS, precision-guided ammunition started to become very accurate, but you can still trace them back. And the advent of drones, especially in 2010, started to provide states to replace human being by weaponized drone. If you look at the counter-terrorist campaign of the United States in Yemen or in Pakistan, they had hardly a few soldier boots on the ground, but they heavily relied on drones. And so technology here starting to be used as a surrogate. The point in case being that operators of the drones in the Middle East were mostly based around Las Vegas. And here you have lots of ethical issues in terms of a distance between the human operator and the battlefield. But the advent of the cyber domain created an entire new domain where plausible deniability was the key characteristic, because attribution in the cyber domain is very difficult. And so basically, not only attribution is difficult, but in the cyber domain, you can benefit from network effect. For instance, on social media, the Russian understood that quite well by coming up with different narratives and using super influencer on social media to spread different narratives. And these narratives basically blurs people's mind, and then you can push your own narrative. If you look at what happened in Crimea, or when the Malaysian airline plane was shut down over Ukraine, you could see that different narratives emerge very quickly after the incident. The idea is really to blur people's mind. But the true technological surrogate will be with the advent of autonomous weapons system, because here we will give agency to a weapon, the decision to take life autonomously. We are not yet there, because these weapons do not exist, but we are moving towards this field, especially since 2016, because the United States released a study on autonomy, and the message was clear. If you want to win war in the 21st century, you need to rely increasingly on autonomous system. If these weapons ever materializes, then they might represent the true surrogate. When we think about the cyber domain, IBM last year developed the first proof of concept of a malware equipped with a neural network. And so basically this neural network was trained to identify a specific face and could be embedded in any kind of video application. Meaning that if I watch if the malware has been trained to identify my face, and just as a snippet, I was in Colombo, Sri Lanka 2 weeks ago, and a participant at the conference took a picture with me. We had no relationship on social media whatsoever, nothing. 10 minutes after he posted his photo on Facebook, Facebook sent me a notification that you might appear in a picture of. So basically, my face had already been identified, recognized by Facebook. And so this malware would only unleash its payload if I identifies that it is my face. And so basically here, the malware, once it is out in the system, it's out, and will have a life on its own. So for small states, for non-state actors, if they get access to this technology, then that will provide them with a massive force multiplier. And here we have huge ethical and philosophical issues in front of us, because technology will be increasingly more important in key decisions in waging war.
Thank you so much. I would like to now talk more about human surrogates. What are some of the political and strategic considerations of using human surrogates?
I think I alluded to some of them already. Well, the consequences of using them, I mean, we always see the benefits, because, governments look for the short term, especially liberal democratic governments look for short-term outcomes, and they look for means to achieve, short-term effect. So in the short term, they seem to provide a panacea to operate in out-of-area, everywhere, protracted conflicts that, are highly unpopular at home. and they can do that without putting, human life at risk, which is, in a very risk-conscious environment that we operate in today, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, I think even more so than in continental Europe. So UK and the US, I think everything is about risk management. They provide you with some ability to do what you used to do with your conventional military, but doing that at very low risks. So the problem with the downside of that is, of course, you lose control, but more looking at the long term. The long term is obviously you are putting arms, training, and capability and capacity into a conflict, and sometimes you increase capacity and capability locally. And you might not know how long you're going to stay in this conflict. And over time, if you look at all these kind of patron-surrogate relationships, over time control erodes, and over time the surrogate kind of because when you start this patron-surrogate relationship, you have the surrogate has some sort of overlapping interests with the patron, and these overlapping interests erode over time. The longer this kind of relationship continues, the more the surrogate will try to seek autonomy. And so you will basically have built a surrogate up that might eventually no longer serve your interests. And we see that increasing. A great example more recently is the Southern Transitional Council, Harakat al-Janubi in southern Yemen, that has been built up by the Emiratis as a way to achieve their objectives with very limited boots on the ground. And I just want to say a little bit about the motivation behind it. Yes, it is a lot about deniability, but we make the case it's not just about deniability. So it is for small states as well a means to basically buy in capacity and capability. So the Gulf states, all of them, have an intrinsic capacity issue. Looking at Qatar, for example, it's a small state of 300,000 people that want to play on the regional stage militarily. So what are they going to do? The UAE as well. They are a slightly bigger country, but they only have 1 million people of indigenous, a bit more than 1 million indigenous people. So how are they going to fight these kind of wars? And the UAE are involved in the Horn of Africa, they're involved in Yemen, they're involved in Libya, they're involved to a degree in Syria. If you have that capacity problem, you need to go to an external surrogate to basically fill that gap and that you have. And this is one of the major motivations of why people do it. And that's a reason why the UAE did it in Yemen, because they just don't have the numbers, considering where they're involved in. What the problem with that is, though, that while initially they had quite good control over the surrogate, over time this control completely eroded. And while the coalition, which is led by by Saudi Arabia, was about reinstating the government of Hadi in Yemen, there's STC, which was supposed to help that effort, has basically now turned on Hadi and basically tried to kick him out from southern Yemen and advance their own secessionist movement. So the UAE have lost control over that particular surrogate, and quite massively, in a way that there's no way for them to get that control back in. And the problem, the consequence of that is while you were trying while initially everything was working towards that one overlapping strategic goal, you over time have now so many candidates and so many groups locally that have been built up that all pursue their own interest. If you look at the market, so I did a lot of research on private military and security companies. They're also a surrogate. Contractors are a very important component of our wars today, particularly in the West. And again, here also the UAE are leading on that front because they're working with a lot of private military companies. Some people call them mercenaries. Here again, what we see with outsourcing in the UK and the United States in particular during the height of the Afghanistan and Iraq operations in 2010 is that a lot of the research that has been done suggests that most of the contractors overcharged and underperformed. And governments have very little, if any, control mechanisms in place to actually hold contractors to account. I think in 2010 there were more US DOD or DOS contractors in Afghanistan and Iraq than there were armed personnel. And that kind of leads to a situation where you have a very small component of, and at the time the component of the US wasn't small, but you have a smaller component of people in uniform than you have surrogates not in uniform. And how does the patron then ensure compliance? It's almost impossible. And so if you have too many surrogates, you usually overpay. you lose control. They usually have their own agenda, and at some point, you're obviously fueling conflict because you pour arms in sometimes an already, a highly volatile environment. And these kind of agents eventually will turn on one another. And we've seen that throughout, if we just look at the proxy wars of the Cold War, we see how this is spun out. A great example is obviously the Taliban and, the Mujahideen and then the Taliban and how that has fueled violent jihadism in Afghanistan. This was our making, if you will. And this is the long-term view. So long-term, surrogate warfare is actually a problem. It's not a panacea. It's definitely not a solution to the problem we're up against. Despite all this, because most liberal governments think 4 years, our government in the UK is probably not even thinking 4 years at this point. But most people look 4 years ahead. There is no real long-term strategic decision-making. And so we opt for an easy way out. And I can see this with debates that I have with practitioners in London, in Washington, and also in other European countries, and obviously also the Gulf states, that it's about trying to find quick solutions, bang for the buck. And surrogates provide you a short-term bang for the buck with a lot of caveat long-term that we are trying to ignore because I can tell you from a British point of view is that Britain is trying to still have and maintain that posture that it has as a upper middle class power, if you will, with a shrinking military. And it's a very simple question. How are you going to have how do you ensure that you can still achieve these strategic objectives, grand strategic objectives, with a shrinking military at home? And the answer is basically a force structure which is leading more and more towards surrogates.
Thank you. Jean-Marc, it's your turn. What are the strategic and political issues of using technological surrogates?
First, to follow up on Andrea's point, using surrogate could also lead eventually to operational security. There was a few years ago an article in the New York Times about the number of contractors that have top security clearances in Washington, and it was about 1 million. So also by delegating power to surrogate contractors, you in the end also weaken your own network. Your question is about the disadvantage?
Yeah, the strategic and political implications or issues of using technological surrogates.
Right. So, as I said, we haven't yet witnessed a true fully autonomous weapons system. But if that ever materializes, first, on the way, we are faced with huge ethical issues that I mentioned already before about the issue of decision to kill. You might remember that last year the US Department of Defense and Google made a partnership for a project called Maven, and the idea of the project, or the concept, was to automatize live drones video feeds so that the operator on its screen would, the burden on the operator would be removed or lessened by the fact that an algorithm would actually identify already different objects on the screen, and obviously friends and enemies. So if you use this logic, as I mentioned earlier, the key discussion at the UN here on the governmental group of experts on lethal autonomous weapons system has come up with this concept of meaningful human control. So if we take the Maven example, for instance, and the entire identification of friend or foe is done by a machine. In the end, you have a human operator that has to say, am I striking or not? And then on your screen you have foe. So I'm striking. To what extent, even though the operator is human, this decision is actually ethical? So these kind of questions that we are faced with in terms of the ethics of the decision. By the way, Maven has been shut down because employees at Google signed a petition to actually force Google to withdraw from the project. But other actors like Amazon's are now bidding for this contract. On a more strategic aspect, there are two things. There is a democratization of this technology that is very, very fast. And so that empowers individuals to levels that we've never seen in history. Think about the Snowden affairs. When you think about Snowden stole millions of data from NSA. And so if you would think about a traditional spy, a spy would go into a building and steal a few documents. Here we're talking, at one point I was talking with a US official that told me they had no idea about the extent, but they were estimating at roughly 70 kilometers of trucks full of documents. You take Geneva, Lausanne, the highway, you put trucks on the highway. This is the extent of Snowden's breach in the system. So one individual can have this strategic impact. So technology diffuses very rapidly. And you have an example these days, very recently, many people are talking about it, now it's deepfakes. You take any video application and you merge anyone's face on any videos application or voices. This technology did not exist prior to 2014. It was invented in 2014. The first application hit the market in December 2017, and 18 months later, we start to see clear security implication where individuals can actually, and the Chinese are using this technology to fake satellite pictures, or anyone can actually create a digital support where you fake, the discussion between President Trump or Boris Johnson, whatever. So this will have huge impact in terms of information security. So there is this democratization of technology, empowerment of individual. The second aspect also is it also empowers established state. And so if technology becomes so powerful, especially artificial intelligence, it has a risk to shift the offense-defense balance from the defensive to the offensive. Currently, we are in a defensive dominant environment. That's why it's relatively stable. If that happens, that will completely shift the way we have to think about security, because in an offensive dominant international environment, the best way to protect yourself is by attacking first. This is the concept of preemption. And if you introduce preemption, you are in violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And so there is a risk that we completely upset the international legal system. So you can see how technology, by giving more autonomy to technology, it has a potential to have dramatic consequences at the structural level, but also at individual level.
Thank you. I think you answered already the next question, which is about how this will change or transform war. So perhaps you could allude to some of the maybe key points from the book on how you believe that surrogates will transform war in general, global security in general, and perhaps national security in particular.
Yeah, we don't have that much time, so I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible. I think the aspect of democratization is an important one, not just with technology, but what basic surrogate warfare allows you to do, if you have money, it makes it increasingly easy for you to put financial power into military power, because and not just by going to the market and buy private military and security company services, but by also just buying and incentivizing a human surrogate, such as a rebel group, and use them. And this is something, and the Gulf states are a great example of this. They were never really actors. They never had a command and control system in place. They never had effective militaries. With the UAE being an exception more recently. But now it doesn't matter. They have a lot of disposable income, if you will, to spend on conflict. So it is a lot easier now to buy and obviously train and equip local forces and let them fight for you. These things could always be done, but today we seem to be more permissive of this, because if the US is doing it, it kind of gives a green light as an opinion jurist to other governments and other states to say the Americans are doing it, why can't we do this? So it has become more and more acceptable. And this is part of the transformation here. I think surrogate warfare becomes more of a norm today than it has been in the past. While during the Cold War, this was not the norm. It was seen at the time as an unconventional way to deal with the system of the Cold War. This type of surrogate warfare seems to be a norm that we accept as a standard. And when we look at conflicts today, and if I know that many people on the strategic level in government today are thinking when they're confronted with a problem, the first choice is not going down the conventional military route. Let's try to find an unconventional way, either using air power or using drone technology or using surrogates or special forces. Anything to make sure that the public does, and this is where I see there is a difference between discretion and deniability. While proxy warfare was all about deniability vis-a-vis the international community, I think surrogate warfare is more about discretion. It is also about deniability, but it's discretion vis-a-vis your own public, finding a discreet way of achieving your strategic objectives.
Jean-Marc, did you want to weigh in on that question as well?
Yeah, so in terms of transformation of warfare, I think the major impact is on the democratization of the decision, and be it technological or human surrogate. I think that is, there was this trend, especially with Clausewitzian Trinity, government, armed forces, and population, that there was an equilibrium between these three actors. And what you do with surrogate, you basically remove the population from the scrutiny of the use of force by governments. And that creates, especially for democratic countries, that creates huge issues of accountability. And that is one of the major impact of surrogate warfare. And obviously the second is about technology and the role that technology will play in the future, and really this aspect of democratization. If any groups can have access to potentially disruptive technology and use it as a surrogate, then I think we will wake up one day with very bad scenarios where malicious actors will have access to technology that can reproduce, and this is the key transformation, the key issue of the transformation of digital technology is scalability. You can have effect at a level that was not possible a few years ago because of scalability of the digital domain.
Thank you so much. Now it's our turn for a discussion. Dr. Michael Roska, could you weigh in on what you thought of the book and maybe some key points?
Thank you very much for inviting me, Jean-Marc and Andreas. It's a very special invitation, and I want to first congratulate the authors for making very substantial contribution to the field of strategic studies. I remember Jean-Marc when we were both PhD students, and I would come to Geneva once a year for a conference, and we would basically write our dissertation. And it's amazing to see, how he has progressed, and how Andreas also is. It's amazing to see them, and it's also very interesting because both of them are Middle East experts, Gulf experts. I'm more East Asia security expert, so I'm here in town for other research. But I had the opportunity to read the book. And so they asked me to provide some few critical comments, and think about it sort of being a devil's advocate and provide some counterpoints. So with that, I have basically three main points. And one thing is that if you look at the changing character of warfare, if you were sitting here 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, every decade we have a book that says that war has been transformed one way or the other. So we can talk about in the 70s how electronic warfare is changing the war. In the early 90s, we talked about low intensity conflicts, asymmetric warfare. Then we talked about, information warfare in mid-90s. Then that has moved into cyber warfare. And last few years, we talked about hybrid warfare. So now the concept of surrogate warfare is another contribution in long-standing, conceptions of warfare. And that tells you one thing, okay, you have warfare is constantly evolving. The character of the warfare is evolving. But as Clausewitzian, people who were in the room who were Clausewitzian, would say the nature of warfare still remains the same. The principles of warfare and strategy remain the same, notwithstanding, the changes in the character of warfare. So that's point one. And in that context, maybe I would like to pose the first question, in what degree does surrogate warfare really, differ from the conceptions of hybrid warfare, that we have talked about for the last 5 years or so. In other words, you can see a lot of similarities between hybrid warfare and surrogate warfare. And the similarity is in the concept of using ambiguity. Right? So the state actors use strategic ambiguity for denial, deception, and as well as non-state actors use tactical ambiguity. But whereas the non-state actors use ambiguity and the conceptions of victory is different. For non-state actors is the victory by non-defeat. So you win wars by not being defeated. So when you talk about, organizations like Hezbollah or ISIS or other sort of, like a non-state actors, they are winning by not being defeated. That actually differs from the state actors, where actually state actors use ambiguity in order to achieve victory, to defeat an opponent. And so there are, so the similarities and differences between surrogate warfare and hybrid warfare was sort of like a first question, and I had in the conceptions of evolving trajectories of evolution of warfare. Another, very interesting paradox, that you can see and you can observe, and you can see that in looking at the East Asian strategic environment vis-a-vis other environments, is you don't see states surrendering their military conventional forces. Right? None major power is surrendering their conventional militaries in support of surrogates. So that means, you still have principal resources in military innovation and modernization going into conventional militaries. So if you think about China, Russia, US, the great powers, even European militaries, they still invest quite a bit of resources into modernizing the traditional militaries, right? So, as you pointed out in the book, surrogate warfare doesn't really replace the conventional militaries. It adds on to that, but you see that most great powers, or even other sort of significant military players, put still significant resources in the conventional militaries. So, at the strategic level, that military modernization provides some sort of level of deterrence, because deterrence still matters for states, right? But at the operational level, which is very interesting, if you think about these flashpoints, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the South China Sea, there you can actually see the elements of surrogate warfare. There you can see its conflicts in the gray zone areas, and you see countries and states relying on non-state actors and non-military technologies, to project influence and project power to attain their political goals. So that leads to a sort of ongoing debate, and this is where we are. If you were sitting here 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we would think about, the revolutionary aspects of new technologies, right? You go back to that, Clausewitzian debate, whereas, the principles and nature of warfare does remain the same. That is, you will still have fog and friction in using other technologies. You will still have, your principal goal is basically to outsmart or dislocate your enemy and his strategy with your strategy. So whether surrogate warfare is another attempt, to provide strategic advantage in order to dislocate many opponents and their strategies. And so in that concept, the principle of warfare is still the same, and ultimately is using force for political ends. So whether it is by surrogates or non-surrogates, you still have the element of violence and using military force for achieve political objectives. So those are just a few thoughts that I have, I think, but ultimately it's a really great book. There has been, like Jean-Marc mentioned, there has been really not significant contribution over the years in terms of, providing both historical, academic, and policy-oriented type of book to put everything together. And the authors have done an amazing job, put a lot of historical examples. So when you read this book, they have done their homework and they go back to, centuries, and where they show examples how surrogate warfare has been used in different conflicts and how that conception has evolved. So I would like to really congratulate them, and I really look forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Raska. Thank you, Jean-Marc Kriegley. Thank you, Andreas Krieg. We've been live streaming this from Geneva, from the GCSP. We are now going to close this session of live streaming. So thank you so much for joining us on the transformation of warfare in the 21st century at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Thank you. Now that the cameras are off, let me please ask you all to ask as frank questions as you want to the panelists. I think this is the exciting part of the discussion, on what you thought of the book, or if you have had a chance to read it. What would you have added? What would you have subtracted? What do you think were the key takeaways from you? What was illuminating for your thinking in terms of the book? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Who would be the first to ask a question?